All right, welcome everybody watching on YouTube to probably a short speedrun episode. Not sure how it'll go. We'll do the usual here, 10-minute game to start, and then we'll take it from there. So without further ado, we're still in the 1200s, and we face Fikri from Indonesia. Good luck. Let's get the show on the road, or not. The difficult position, there's 20 candidate moves. Okay, there we go. Our opponent has made a decision. 1e4. Okay, c4. Now, this is a move that probably is not on most people's radar. I mean, maybe you faced it, but chances are you don't know much about it. It looks very ugly because it creates a massive hole on d4. But as I've kind of said before, you want to be careful about assuming that moves like these lose. They definitely don't lose, and if white follows up accurately, then c4 is actually a pretty legitimate sideline, which can contain some venom, believe it or not. Now, our follow-up is pretty obvious. We should start with knight c6, really just clamping down on this d4 square. One thing that we should avoid with black is to play e5. We shouldn't just pair at white's setup. As is often the case, we have a choice of different pawn structures that we could apply. I think that, the experienced Sicilian players who are watching this are probably inclined to play g6, and I think this is the standard way to play. We go g6, we fianchetto the bishop, and we just increase our control over the d4 square. But that's definitely not the only viable setup. We can also play e6, and we can try to carry out the d7, d5 pawn break as quickly as possible. What do we want to do in this game? Yeah, let's go g6. Let's play more conventionally. And again, remember that you don't have to be a dragon player to play the move g6, right? It doesn't matter what Sicilian you play. This should be a pretty logical move. Fianchettoing the bishop here should make sense independent of what type of Sicilian you play against the open Sicilian. Okay, now here we have a secondary choice of where to develop this knight on g8. So the obvious developing square is f6, but the drawback of developing the knight to f6 is that we are somewhat decreasing our clamp on the d4 square. So we could also carry out what I've heard referred to as the Botvinnik setup. Now, the Botvinnik setup involves basically putting the g8 knight on e7, so playing the move e6, putting the knight on e7, and the point is that the knight and the bishop are nicely cooperating, and the bishop is still unobstructed on the long diagonal. Both setups are totally fine. It's a good idea to start with the move d6, so we're going to start by making the moves we know that we need to play anyway. And based on what white does, we'll decide where we want to deploy this knight. Okay, bishop e2. So white is playing kind of standard developing moves. Before we choose a developing square for our knight, I think it's a good idea here to initiate a favorable trade. Now, our entire kind of play revolves around constantly increasing our control over the d4 square. And the point is not necessarily to put a knight on d4, right? It's more important to control a square than it is to put a piece on that square. Sometimes putting a piece on that square is good, but that's not really our goal just yet. So what's a good way for us to increase our control over this square? Well, you can do it in two ways. You can add attackers, or you can remove defenders of a certain square. And that second method is what people often forget about, right? They think about moves like queen b6 or e5, but the knight on f3 can also be dealt with the move bishop g4. And that is the move we're going to play. And of course, we want to take on f3. Now, you might say, well, aren't we giving up the bishop pair? We're making two moves with the same piece in the opening. Yeah, that's true. But because the center is closed, and because we have a bigger priority in this situation, that kind of supersedes these general opening rules. We don't have any problems with our development. Our king is not going to get stuck in the center. So it should be pretty obvious to you that we're not going to get punished for, this small opening violation. Now we're going to finish up the Botvinnik setup. We're going to go e6, and we're going to put the knight on e7, and our pieces are going to be really nice and harmonious. Another thing you might notice is that we're combining the moves e6 and g6 in the Sicilian, and on previous speedruns, you might have heard me say that this is one of the cardinal sins of the Sicilian, but again, this is a completely different scenario. I was referring to situations in which the center is open, right, in which white can access the d6 square. This is not one of those situations. The center is completely closed. that principle does not apply at all. Okay, let's go h6. Let's see where this bishop wants to park itself. Get bishop h4. And now we have an interesting kind of dilemma. Again, because we have a nice positional advantage and because we have a clamp on this d4 square, there's going to be many good ways to play a position like this. So if you're watching this and your intuition is suggesting one move and then I end up playing another move, it doesn't mean that your idea is bad. The way that I'm going to play this is perhaps going to strike you as a little bit loose or a little bit too risky. But hopefully I'll show you that this is in fact not risky at all. And this isn't even tactical. The way I'm about to play is motivated by positional considerations and not by a desire to just like checkmate our opponent. What move am I hinting at? I'm hinting at the move g5. And again, the point of g5 is very positional. We're not trying to go h5 and build a pawn storm. That would be nice, but we're unable to make that move. The point of g5 is to carve out this g6 square for our knight. And notice how we're playing on the dark squares. Bishop h5, okay, that's fine. Now, maybe white wants to take on g6, but that's not really a tactical threat. Maybe it's a positional threat. We have several ways that we can deal with this. We can put this knight on f4. We can play knight g to e5. Let me think about this for a second. Yeah, I like the look of knight f4. I like the look of knight f4. We're trying to get sort of the perfect material imbalance. We're trying to get opposite colored bishops to really emphasize the weakness of the dark squares for white. So knight b5. Not sure what this move does. I mean, we can play a6 and push the knight away. We could take on b2 probably, although that's not really in the spirit of the position. I mean, I don't see why we would go pawn grabbing here. I think a6 is safer and simpler and probably just better. So let's go a6. Let's go a6. I think the knight simply has to go back to c3. And we're going to continue playing positionally and increasing our bind over the center. Bishop takes f4. Okay, so our opponent plays an intermezzo. We take back on f4. Of course, we don't want to take the knight here because we give up the bishop pair, and white could have taken c takes b5, leading to some unnecessary complications. Now white goes back to c3. Now, as I've said many times, anytime you have a trade, you need to reassess the situation briefly, and you need to quickly ask yourself, okay, what new squares are available for our pieces? How has the situation changed? And if you do that kind of mindfully, you should immediately see that you have access to a really juicy post for your queen. And that post is g5, queen to g5, really solidifying all of the pawns, adding pressure to the bishop, and hinting at the possibility of an attack down the g-file later in the game. In terms of where we're keeping our king, we're keeping it in the center because it's a perfectly safe place to be. There's nothing, there's no danger looming in the center. But eventually we could castle queenside if need be. Now I'm starting to smell blood. This is clearly a panic move, a panic reaction by white, which walks right into either knight d4 or knight e5. But knight d4 is more thematic because that's been the move that we've been setting up for a while. Now, am I contradicting myself? Earlier I said the point isn't necessarily to put the piece on the outpost. Yeah, but here, clearly this is not a move that's going to harm our position. And white is really on the verge here of collapsing. I think queen h3 is probably the best move. Maybe white can go queen g4. Yeah, we could also have gone knight e5. I think both moves are fantastic. Queen back to d1, excellent. Now, again, many ways that we can play, but I see a pretty low-risk move that we could play just to set up tactical possibilities in the long run. f3, some of you might be tempted by, doesn't work. White just plays bishop takes f3. Knight takes f3, queen takes f3. That doesn't work. I like the move rook g8. And this is the kind of move that people really need to learn how to make. Am I creating a threat? Technically not, right? Black doesn't threaten anything yet, but you're setting stuff up, right? You're building up the attack. You're bringing pieces into position. And pretty soon you'll find that something will materialize. How do we continue bringing pieces into position? What does that even mean? Well, in order to increase our domination over the g-file, it would be nice to get this bishop out of the way. Let's put it on e5. This also prevents white from seeking desperation counterplay with a move like e5, which is very easy to forget about, right? White can open up the center even at the cost of a pawn, which would complicate the winning process. Notice how we've achieved complete dark square domination. Knight, bishop, and queen all on dark squares. White's bishop totally helpless. White can't go knight e2 because we take the bishop. It obstructs the connection between the queen and the bishop. This would be a very common blunder at this level to go knight e2. And that just blunders mate. Our next move can be long castles. And then we can start thinking about sacrifices and, mating operations. a3. I don't care about that. Let's just castle. There is no way. I mean, b4 blunders a piece, actually. But even if it didn't, it'll take literal ages for white to even get a threat on the queen side. I mean, how many moves does white need to start the attack? I don't think it's even hypothetically possible. Like rook b1, b5, we'll just go a5. But here, the simplest is just to pick up the piece. Let's go knight takes f3 and bishop takes c3. And now we're going to play with maximum simplicity, simplify the position. So queen to g4 is on my horizon. Okay, obviously rook c1 hits the bishop. Let's re-centralize it onto d4. And that's it. Okay, b5, we can just go a5, close up the queen side. And here, okay, I just said that I'll play queen g4, but I see a better option. I think queen to h4 is a more efficient path to victory. And our goal here is to double on the g file. Rook g5, rook g8, maybe rook h5. We also have a really pretty tactical threat that we've posed here. Good opportunity for people to practice your tactical awareness. Yeah, we can play it now. It's actually, maybe it's unnecessary. I'm not going to do it, but you should at least notice this idea. Yeah, actually, it doesn't work. That's kind of funny. I don't think it works. Rook g3, hg, fg. And you should see that queen takes g3 is impossible. We just take the queen and the f-pawn is pinned. But rook g3, hg, fg, white slides the rook out of f1. And this is another super important defensive theme. Sometimes when the evacuation route is created, it's incredibly hard to actually deliver checkmate because the white king is going to move along the light squares to e2, and we've sacrificed an entire rook. So this is unnecessary. Let's go rook g5, and let's follow up with our initial idea. Rook b1. Now, you don't want to entirely ignore what your opponent is doing, but here we can't, because white's not doing anything. That's it. The game is over. We're crashing through. And at this point, there's a million ways to do it. But the simplest is just rook takes g2. That's bound to lead to checkmate. Just, yeah, GG. Also, rook h5, by the way, is a more subtle way, perhaps even more powerful and efficient way to bring about victory. Rook h5. And you should be asking yourself, well, what happens if white goes h3? White simply resigns. Simple game. We didn't do anything in this game that should cause you any surprise. Like, we played simple textbook positional chess, nothing crazy, nothing outlandish, and, white was unable to deal with the weakness he created on the second move. Let's go through that pretty quickly. I mean, there isn't too much to explain, but nevertheless, just a moment. Now, here's a very important clarification. Is the move c4 a mistake? No, I don't think that you can consider this a mistake per se. However, if you do a search for the move c4, you will see that the top-rated player who's played this move is, let's see, just a moment here. I'm going to tell you the answer to that question. It's been played by Badur Jabava, Lenyar Dominguez, Dragan Solak, Turkish GM, Sebastian Mays. A million GMs have played this move, OTB. But the point is that if a GM is playing this move, it means that they know exactly how to follow up. But if a 1200 is playing this move, it means that they don't know what they're doing. Because if white simply follows up with regular developing moves and is not specifically aware of the correct way to follow up, white's going to get cooked. So it is a decent line if white is like a specialist, right? It's a surprise weapon. But the way that our opponent played it, clearly indicates that this was not like preconceived preparation, if that makes sense. Okay, so knight c6, knight c3, g6. This is the main line. And the way that most GMs play it is that they go g3. And they basically try to get this into like English opening territory. Bishop g7, this is the main line. 3,000 games, bishop g2. And the engine eval here is equality. Black can do a bunch of different things. I mean, d6, for example. Now, typically, white plays knight g2. And actually, it's white who plays the Botvinnik setup here. At least the people who know what they're doing. And typically, black will respond with knight f6, castles, and we get this interesting position. where black is very comfortable game, but white is not worse if white is accurate here. Now, who can tell me what is black's textbook plan in this type of situation? And this is a plan that is applicable in many, many different openings. You know, you should kind of understand this based on white's structure. No, what is black's plan? Yeah, white's plan is like f4, h3, g4. What is black's plan here, typically? Yeah, a6, b5. So typically black's plan is to play a6 and prepare b7, b5, and prepare the queenside attack. Now, you might ask, well, in what other openings is this plan applied? I can give you a million examples. In the closed Sicilian, for example, which is knight c3 and g3, same opening, except white's pawn is on c2. One of black's main ideas, in fact, my favorite line against the closed Sicilian is the move rook b8 here, just immediately preparing this b7, b5 pawn storm. In the King's Indian attack, it's also a very, very typical plan, and it can be very effective. Let me show you an example, just to show you the universality of this idea. Okay, so here he played the King's Indian attack. I like the setup with c5. We basically transposed into a similar position. And here you can see the elements that I applied in the speedrun game. Rook b8. Now I decided to give up my light skirt bishop because it's kind of a burden. And there we go. Knight back, opening up the diagonal, and a6. Here we go. f4, b5. Expansion on the queen side. c3, b4. Immediately targeting this weak pawn on c3. And white tries to set up some counterplay, but eventually he falls apart very, very quickly, and I win a pawn, and I win the game. So against a lot of these anti-Sicilian setups, with or without a white pawn on c4, this a6, b5 approach is very effective. But there are some pitfalls that you need to be aware of. For example, if white plays h3, let's go back to the speedrun scene. This is something that as a Sicilian player, you need to hammer into your mind. Never play, well, not never, almost never play b5 in this situation, not because it blunders a pawn, but because it walks into e5. This is constantly blundered by players of all levels. In order to prepare b5, you need to move your rook to b8. Very, very important. And get out of the pin. So rook b8. The other important thing to remember, if white plays f4, same thing. Do not play b5. Again, e5 wins a piece. So you should just notice this trap. You should commit this to memory. And there's a million ways that you can circumvent this. The computer likes to move knight to e8 with three ideas. The first, of course, is to move the knight away from the line of fire. The second is to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And the third, more subtle idea is that in the event that white does not cooperate, you are then able to repurpose this knight to c7 and insist on playing b5. Now you might be like, well, what if white plays a5? Well, then the a5 pawn can be easily picked off. The knight continues its journey to e6 and eventually to d4, but more importantly, white will lose this pawn. Knowing how to maneuver in these types of positions, it's not easy, and it takes some study, but black is actually doing really, really well here. The bishop is fine on c8. Now, sometimes you can put the bishop on d7. Other times, so for example, why does white play h3? Why is that the main move? If white plays f4 immediately, for example, then if you want, you can go bishop g4 and trade the bishop off, but you don't have to. You can go rook b8 here, and the bishop is totally fine on its initial square. One thing that I would avoid if I were you in most situations is to play the move knight d4 if you have to recapture with a pawn. As a matter of fact, even if you can recapture with the bishop, you rarely just like put a knight on d4 unless you can recapture with the knight. And the reason why is that this is not a positive transformation for black most of the time. Why not? Because, well, the pawn on d4 is a weakness. The bishop on g7 is like WTF. And you're giving black, you're giving white pretty easy expansion on the king side. So just a couple of pointers, but this is the main line. Our opponent obviously doesn't know this, and they start with d3, which in and of itself is not a bad move if white now plays g3, but that's not how our opponent plays it. They go knight f3. And already I would argue that after d6, black is better, because this is not a congruent setup for white. KTM asks, what does black do with a pawn on b5? Pushing b4 only seems to work if there's a pawn on c3. Okay, let's go back to our analysis here. So what you're asking is, let's say white plays a move like this, bishop e3, correct? If I understand your question. Let's say the black plays b5, And let's say that white plays a move like queen d2. What the heck do you do from this point on? It really depends on how white sets up their pieces. But here, for example, you can actually go knight d4. Now, clearly, this is not what I just said about knight d4 does not apply because white can't take back with a knight. And if white has to take back with a bishop, well, then we get control of a lot of dark squares. And in addition, after knight to d1, bc, dc, e5, I mean, look at this monster of a pawn on d4. We have the b file. So that's one option. And you might see, well, what if white doesn't play bishop e3? Well, let's say white plays g4. Let's say white plays g4, black plays b5, and I don't know, white plays knight g3, for example. Well, now you can just attack on the queen side, queen a5. It's a good idea to keep your pawn on b5. You normally do not want to go b4 unless white's pawn is on c3, because this clarifies the situation on the queen side. You want to keep open the option of bc, so that if white moves the bishop, you play bc, and then you can already take the pawn on b2 and win. So the basic answer is you put the pawn on b5, and then it's a good idea to maintain the tension. In response to bishop e3, knight d4 is excellent. If white doesn't put the bishop on e3, often queen a5, like knight c7, knight e6, knight d4, you're basically playing with your pieces until an opportune moment arises to play bc. That's obviously a pretty general answer. And I'm not going to encapsulate everything in one analysis, so let's move on. Once we were able to exchange on f3 and play e6, black is completely, black is better. Everything is copacetic. Bishop f4, our opponent just like completely aimless. I think that our opponent was relying on knight b5. But what's funny is that we actually can ignore the threat. We can play castle short. This is a super instructive point for people to realize. If white takes with the knight, then we win a piece with e5. Classic idea, knight takes b7, queen b6, everything is hanging. Okay, that's number one. But who can explain what happens if white takes with the bishop? Here, we actually play positionally. You don't win a piece here. You play for massive positional compensation for the pawn. What am I talking about? So a6 is correct. This forces white to play bishop takes e7. We play queen takes e7. The knight has to drop back. And we put a rook on d8. And just like take a moment to appreciate the bind the black has on the dark squares. It does not matter that white is up a pawn. This is dead weight. Black is just totally dominating all of the key squares. This bishop is awful. And if white plays bishop b2, we can go knight d4 and quickly push b5 with tremendous queenside pressure. Also you can go knight e5 here. So there's no shortage of ways to defend the pawn. Our opponent played bishop g5. And now we start playing on the dark squares, g5 and knight g6. Classic type of maneuver, bishop h5, knight f4. And there was just one tactical subtlety that I wanted to illustrate, which is that if white had taken on f4 and played the move queen g4, you have to be very careful. What should black do in this position? Because actually this is a fork. It's not queen g4, it's queen g fork. How does black defend against both, actually all three threats at the same time? So king f8 ignores the pawn in f4. I don't want to give that pawn away that easily. The big threat is queen takes e6, which is what some of you are missing. Queen takes c6, can't ignore that. The move is actually queen f6. So queen g5 also blunders queen e6. You have to go queen f6. Very important. And as a matter of fact, the computer shows that white can equalize with knight e2, which is a move that I missed. King to e7, coordinating the rooks. Knight take, well, black is slightly better. Knight takes f4, knight e5. And again, we have this massive compensation for the pawn because we have total dark square control. So maybe knight f4 was a little bit incautious, but anyway, that's a pretty advanced point. Knight b5, a6, just chasing the knight away. Takes. And here, one more important point. What if white would have played queen g4 in this position? Here, we have a simpler way to defend against everything. We can just castle kingside. And after knight c3, we bring the queen out to g5. And obviously, even in the endgame, all of our advantages remain. And all of our plans remain the same. We can still basically go rook b8 and b5, engineering a decisive queenside attack. So, now some of you were asking, why not take on b2? Largely, I made the decision intuitively, but bishop takes b2 is the best engine move. You're right. I could have taken it. I just felt a little bit reluctant to allow play on the queen side, but it is true after bishop e5, there is no play on the queen side. I just made like a general decision. Nothing at all wrong with bishop takes b2. So anyways, queen g5, queen f3, and knight d4. And at this point, white's position is collapsing very quickly. Rook g8, setting up threats on the g file. Bishop f3, bishop e5, using the dark squares. And long castles, preparing to deploy the second rook. The rest is very straightforward. I have one pretty amazing moment here. I could have played a much more beautiful move than knight takes f3, and I'm kind of sad I didn't play it because I saw it, but I was a little bit afraid of making a fool of myself. The computer indicates that there is a ridiculous idea. Can anybody find it? It's really pretty. Really pretty. Yeah, it's queen takes g2. Full on queen sack and f3. And actually the cool follow-up here is that, okay, first of all, if white ignores the threat, then rook takes g2, rook takes h2, and rook g8 is mate. But if white tries to give the queen back and get the king to safety, here the fine point is that we go knight h4 with a double attack on the bishop and the knight. This actually is the top engine move by a little bit. Nothing wrong with the way I played, but it just shows you how when you dominate, a color complex, this is how powerful it can be, and it can very, very quickly translate to tactical victory. Really pretty concept. Instead, we grab the piece. And the last point that I wanted to make is, again, avoiding overly fancy decisions when they're not necessary. Like, unless you know for a fact that this leads to mate, there's absolutely no need to go for this. And you should remember that just because you're threatening a mate like this on h2 doesn't mean the game is over. And people often forget about moves like rook d1, which open up an evacuation route for the king. And if you don't have the machinery in place, like if the e-file was open, we would go rook e8 here. But because the center is closed, the king actually is able to escape. There's a game that I like to show people as a cautionary tale in this topic, and that is, let me just find it really quickly. This is a very high-level game. Ulf Anderson, probably you've heard of. So this was a game in which white basically had a win a little bit earlier. White is attacking. And here Iliescas played rook h3. Some of you might have seen this in a previous speedrun. What should black do? Is black busted here? Is it mate? Or can black keep the game going with a fearless, intrepid defensive move? What should the... Now, this is a direct application of the concept I'm talking about, so the move should not be too difficult. What's the move here? Black to play. So obviously, white is what is white threatening, first of all? White is threatening to take the knight and then to deliver mate on h7. So what would the logical move is h6. But if you're experienced with attacking chess, you should see bishop takes h6, just crashing through immediately. So Anderson plays king g8, and it turns out that black is actually not worse here. So white had to play rook g3, but Iliescas is like, well, bishop f6 obviously wins, right? Bishop f6, queen h7, king f8. And amazingly, black is totally fine here because even though the e-file is open, white can't occupy it because black is controlling it. So white gave another check. The king runs into the center. Now rook to d7, and the king evacuates all the way to d8 where it's completely safe, and white loses the game actually pretty quickly thereafter. Remember that king actually can escape on its own 2 feet, even though this looks completely decisive. All right, so that's why we didn't play rook g3. We played rook g5, and white resigned here, but we would have finished off the game with rook h5, h3, and now rook g3 is not a sacrifice, but rather wins on the spot, chasing away the queen, and now it's simple mate, a million different ways. So, you can consider this game an introduction to sort of like basic positional reasoning, where our initial setup revolved around the d4 square. Remember this Spotbinic setup with the knight on e7, bishop on g7, very typical against a lot of anti-Sicilians. And once white started to show that they were pretty aimless, we transitioned to like a direct kingside attack. Okay, Daniel Chess says, I don't understand rook g3. Well, the point is to chase the queen away, right? If you can chase the queen away, we have rook takes g2. So rook g3 hits the queen. You can't take because of the pin. The point is just to move, force the queen back, and now simple move like rook takes g2, or even queen takes h3, also mate, doesn't matter. Okay, let's play a 5-minute game and get a slightly different vibe. Black against the 1768. Okay, our blitz rating is actually pretty high, and we have another Sicilian. Okay, let's see if we get a mainline knight arf. No, we will get a delayed Alapin. Which is actually not such a common guess at sort of the intermediate level. And it's not a particularly dangerous opening in the sense that you won't lose even if you don't know what to do. The only time that you'll lose is if you play knight takes c4. And all of you should be familiar with this trap. Knight takes c4, blunders a piece to queen a4 check, which is, has existed since time immemorial. And, these types of tricks you should be familiar with if you're a serious Sicilian player. There are many, many ways that we can respond to this setup, but I'm going to play the old school move, which is bishop to d7. This used to be recommended in a lot of Sicilian books that I kind of grew up with in the early 2000s. I don't know if it's still like the top computer choice. I don't know if like Geary recommends it in his Chessable course, but at this level, you don't need the top of the line state-of-the-art setup. You can just play a regular move and you're fine. The point of bishop d7 is very simple. You're immediately reinforcing the threat of knight takes c4, and you're making it difficult for white to claim the center with d4. Okay? So d3, and that's a good sign. If white has to play the move d3, that means we don't really need to worry about white grabbing control of the center, and now we can continue calmly with our development. Now, just like in the previous game, e6 feels a little bit awkward to me. It just feels passive. So intuitively, I think it's pretty clear that we need to fianchetto our bishop. This is the most harmonious setup. And now we castle. And now, actually, there are some really interesting similarities in these two games. And you can already borrow some knowledge to kind of put yourself in my shoes and try to figure out how I'm going to play. What I'm noticing here is that we have basically a very similar roadmap of eventually sending our b pawn down the board. But b5 isn't really going anywhere. Likely on the next move, white's going to play h3. We should also remember that white wants to go d4. And so what positional operation seems to do a lot of things at the same time? This is also a move that we might be deprived of pretty shortly. I'm talking about bishop g4. Give the bishop up for the knight. Now develop the knight to c6, making it hard for white to push d4. And now our goal is to carry out the plan that I just demonstrated in the previous game. So we can already play b5 here. It does work tactically because e5, knight takes e5. But it's a good idea to throw in this move knight d7, just like I did in that tournament game I showed you briefly. Again, reinforcing our control over the d4 square and making the b5, b4 advance even more effective because the c3 pawn will then be under some serious fire. Okay, queen e3 doesn't really do anything. Let's go b5. Just carrying out the textbook plan. f4, and already white is in huge trouble because if white takes, he loses the queen. How did I see that so quickly? Well, the moment queen e3 happened, I noticed the alignment of the king and the queen, right? So f4 triggered that tactical impulse, but I noticed that when white played queen e3. Anytime the queen and the king are on the same diagonal and you have a bishop of that color, you should be on the alert. Okay, so white gives up the pawn and white is collapsing. Okay, rook b1. So how do we maximize our chances on the queen side? Well, what I wouldn't recommend here is just to play c takes b2. That's kind of cooperative. And white's going to take back with the bishop and we're going to be up a pawn, but it feels like we can squeeze more out of the situation. As a lot of you are pointing out, I like rook b8 a lot because it just paralyzes white. It stops bc, and it also threatens c takes b2. And now we're really coming in on the dark squares. Queen to e2. Okay, so white's not actually threatening anything, which is a sign that we can continue kind of building up the pressure on the queen side. How can we continue? What does it even mean to build up the pressure? Well, it's not a hypothetical term, right? It just means getting pieces into the attack. Asking yourself what pieces could be contributing to the queenside attack and then putting them in position. I like queen a5. Yeah, this is simple and strong. attacking a2. Just follow your gut here. This is not rocket science. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that the queen is making potential contact with the rook on e1. So this is where the tactical pattern recognition kicks in. And so why is that important? Well, that is important because the c pawn can move forward to c2. But if you think about it, white can play queen takes c2, and at that point, the rook on e1 is undefended save for the knight on f3. But we have the perfect way of eliminating the knight. We can start with knight d4. And if white takes on d4, we take with the bishop. And technically, white can go bishop e3, and probably white should, but he's not going to. And that means c2 works like a charm. And he's got to go rook b2, but then white starts dropping. Okay, this is not... Actually, this is a funny idea, bishop d2, because we do make the queen, but after bishop takes a5, the queen is almost trapped. Fortunately, we have queen b2. So don't, rush in these situations. Just take a moment to make sure that you're not making some random blunder. That's it. The game is over. Let's go knight f6. And let's finish this one efficiently. We can continue taking stuff on the queen side. We can go queen f2. We can go bishop f2 and win another rook. Everything is falling here. And white loses the game. g3. Okay, takes. We don't even have to take immediately, but we will. And now queen to c1. g4, and we can go around and take this pawn. That's why I played queen c1. Okay, now, again, there's a gazillion ways that we can convert this. I'm noticing that g5 would lead to an exchange of queens. However, white has queen h6. So immediately you ask yourself, well, can I protect the h6 square to set up the possibility of g5? And you might say, well, what about h6? But that's a classic, tactical mistake, because when you go g5, you block off the queen's connection with that square. Use your king. Use your king. And something people forget about all the time. Use your king sparingly, of course, and carefully, but the king can fulfill these very basic tasks like controlling a particular square. And we basically pre-move g5. Like, it doesn't actually matter if white plays bishop g3, which I think our opponent will play. We can still play g5 because there are no desperados there. There are no desperados there. And here, of course, g5, forcing the queen trade and making the conversion much, much easier. Much, much easier. Yeah, the game is over. Hopefully white resigns. He probably won't. Yeah, bishop g3. Okay, actually, we can be fancy here with queen takes e4 check. We could have played queen e3 and just won the queen, but whatever, doesn't matter. We have plenty of material with which to work. d5. Remember, two main ways to win a position like this efficiently. One is just to open up files and infiltrate with your rook. The other is to essentially push forward your passed pawn. But c4 is, I think, the easiest way, opening up that b file. And this is a good thing to practice. Like, if you're watching this and you feel like you struggle, and this is not embarrassing, like this is a source of struggle for a lot of players. Like, when you've got 20 seconds in a position like this, a lot of people struggle to convert with limited time. So you can practice this against the computer. Set up this position, see if you can make your conversion efficient, and then see where you're getting held up. Because when you watch me convert this in 10 seconds, it looks easy, but a lot of people, have a hard time delivering that final step, which is understandable. Converting is hard. Okay, so a very similar game in spirit to the previous game. This time we face the delayed Alapin. Of course, the sort of main Alapin is c3, and much like the accelerated dragon, it's sort of a misnomer because the delayed Alapin and the Alapin are very different openings, like totally different types of positions. And the reason is that after knight f6, white doesn't really have the move e5. This is a move. This exists, but it's much more innocuous than like in the mainline Alapin because black can play de. And the delayed Alapin has a lot of theory behind it. Like, if you really want to be a conscientious Sicilian player, you have to study it carefully because it's gotten pretty popular lately at a high level, and it's got some venom. Like, it's if you just kind of waltz in unprepared, you can get a slightly worse position pretty easily. So by the way, knight f6, e5, you're supposed to go takes, takes, and knight b to d7, just immediately dealing with this knight. So this is clearly an innocuous setup. What has been popular lately are a couple of moves that used to be considered kind of fringe. And one of them is what's called the Kopek system, which is the move bishop d3, which may seem completely outlandish to you, like what the heck is white doing? But you just have to look one step forward. The point of this setup is that if black, for example, plays knight c6, white is going to drop the bishop back to c2. And white is going to quickly try to prepare d2, d4. So if black just like randomly develops and ignores the danger, black actually does end up slightly worse here after d4. So you have to know bishop d3, and I won't bog you down with tons of theory. Knight c6 is a good move here, but after bishop c2, you have to be alert, and you have to go bishop g4. So this you have to remember. Typically, white plays h3. You can drop back to h5, and you're basically discouraging white from going d4. Now, if white goes g4, then white is like weakening himself on the king side, so that's kind of unthinkable. And if white does go d4 anyway, then you can go cd, cd. And among other things, you can play bishop takes f3, forcing white to play the super awkward move gf. And now you can counter-strike in the center with d5. And if white plays e5, actually this is a instructive positional moment for people to chew on. Where should the knight go? Where should the knight go, in your opinion? And this is kind of a cool, yeah, this is a positional exercise, actually. So not g8, not d7. I mean, knight d7 is the obvious move, but that's not correct. The point is knight h5. Yeah, knight h5. What is the kind of goal of black's setup? The goal of black's setup is to clamp down on the f4 square. Okay? And if white plays f4, you go g6. And let's say that white plays knight c3 and develops. Now you play, well, there's a bunch of things that black can do here, but you can actually drop your knight back to g7. And then you play the move e6, and then you have completely immobilized white's queenside pawns. In what other opening do you get this type of positional play? There's an opening called the Gurganidze system, which Hikaru plays. If you watch Hikaru's stream, you'll see him play this a lot, this c6, g6 idea. And if white follows the main line, you get a very similar type of structure where black is basically trying to slow white down by establishing a light square blockade. So often you see black playing this quizzical move h5. And if white doesn't know what to do, and basically like stumbles into this position, you can get a very similar situation where we have this total grip on the f5 square. And then we can start playing on the king side. Same exact thing here. Knight h5, in order to prevent or at least discourage white from playing f5. If white plays f5 anyway, you still go knight g7. And this is an advanced idea. So some of you might be kind of confused about what's going on here, but you're hitting this pawn. And you're immediately disarming the pressure. Fg, hg. And then the rook has the h4 square. Actually, knight c3, rook h4 is really strong. You can also go queen d7 and hit the h-pawn. But the point is to control these squares. You don't need to develop this bishop. This is kind of the point. The bishop is fine sitting on f8 for the time being. At least until the knight gets out of g7. And then you can bring it out to h6. So that's kind of the zen of black's setup. The other big line here is h3. This is what Jospin plays to prevent bishop g4. And here, among many things that you can do, you can go e5, bishop c2, and d5, essentially beating white to the punch in the endgame, in the center. And if white plays e takes d5, you take with a queen, and you get this really interesting kind of reverse Maróczy Bind setup. If white plays d3, you can start immediately attacking this pawn by castling queenside, and black is completely fine. If you're watching this and you're like an intermediate player, you don't really need to know this that deeply, but it's kind of good to have a general roadmap against bishop d3 because it's gotten pretty popular. So bishop e2 was the game continuation. We played bishop d7, and I think that the modern move here is actually, like, what do people play in 2024? Let me check. Yeah, queen c2 seems to be the move that most top players are playing nowadays. And here, actually, the old book recommendation is queen c7. which is a really funny move. But the point is to discourage d4, because here we play cd, and white can't take back with a pawn. So black's kind of setup revolves around making it hard for white to play d4. Typically, white castles, and now we go g6. You already kind of know this. Grishuk has gone d4 here anyway. C takes d4, and knight takes d4. But if white has to take back with a knight, it's a clear sign that, the white has admitted that his setup is not all that effective. We can go knight c6, and bishop e3. I'm seeing the game Svidler versus Gelfand, 2014. Gelfand played d5, great move, expanding in the center. Svidler played knight to d2. And after bishop g7, black is super comfortable. You've gotten everything you wanted here. So that's a little bit of theory for you. There's other lines to investigate, like h3 is a move here as well. But I'm going to give you this in bite-sized pieces. Remember that knight takes e4 blunders the knight. That is a super common trap. Do not fall for this. There's no excuse now that you've seen this video. So our opponent played d3, which makes our task quite easy. We go g6. And bishop f1 is actually a positional mistake already, I think. It's not a big one, but allowing bishop g4 typically gives black a very, very easy game. Here, white makes a follow-up mistake. I think that the best move for white is knight b to d2 in order to be able to recapture on f3 with the knight. And after knight c3, h3, takes, yeah, you get sort of a very typical position where now we can go rook b8, we can go knight d7, but white is able to push d4 pretty quickly here. So as a matter of fact, maybe after knight b to d2, white is a little bit better. And maybe instead of bishop g4, we should have started with knight c6 and kind of tested white's intentions. In response to h3, we can start expanding on the queen side. We can even play the move e5 here to discourage d4. But yeah, knight b to d2 definitely was the best move for white. After h3, this queen is super awkward, and white has been set back and is now completely unable to push d4. So knight d2, knight d7, which is now kind of a move that should be on your radar. And we just follow through on the textbook plan, which wins immediately. Like, look how quickly this leads to the total destruction of white's position. Because he can't take, this drops the queen. I think white's only move was probably knight b1. And here we can follow up with a5. The point being, we want to drive this pawn all the way down to a3. White has no moves. Like, if white plays a4 themselves, now we have a brilliant tactic. How do you find this tactic? Well, this should be on your radar because you should be noticing this alignment. But the moment white plays a4, you should notice that the b3 square has been weakened. So what are we talking about here? What move are we talking about here? Yeah, knight d4 is exactly right. You're threatening a fork, but you're also threatening to infiltrate to b3. So if white drops the queen back, for example, then we can now play knight b3. This is, by the way, why we wanted to wait for white to play a4. Yeah, now, once we eliminate this dark squared bishop, white is permanently suffering on the dark squares. We can play f5, kind of opening up a second front. White's position should collapse here pretty quickly. So this is crushing. Now, the way that white played it, rook b8, we just keep the pressure, and the game is over. Queen a5, b3, and knight d4. Again, how do I see this quickly? I basically follow the rules of tactics. I make the right observations. Right, so the key was to notice this potential alignment. A lot of you, I think, noticed it, but some of you might have discounted it because the rook is seemingly well defended by two of white's pieces. But that's often an illusion that causes you to miss sequences that involve exploiting undefended pieces. Because oftentimes you think a piece is well defended, but you can use the resources at your disposal to engineer a situation where that piece is quickly undefended. And that reality is often not as far away as you might think. Okay, here's a quick example that I was giving recently in a lesson. Just a random GM game, white to play and win in this position. So white to play and win. White wins in 3 moves. And I'm basically going to walk you through the concepts here. There are 2 things that you should notice quickly. The first is that you have, obviously, a potential lollies mate. And you can do that by trying to get a queen to h6. But the second is that if you play a move like queen takes a3, you hit the bishop on a6. And you should also notice that there is contact being made with the rook on f8. But that may seem irrelevant because, well, how on earth are you ever going to get the king away from g8? But combining these two concepts yields the correct sequence of moves. Using the threat of mate, you need to force the black king onto h7, and then by taking on a3, it becomes a fork. So you can go queen h3. Actually, queen e3 is also good. Black is going to go h5. Black will not cooperate, but you make another threat of mate. You go queen e3. Now black has no choice because of this threat, but to play king h7. Now you play queen takes a3, and it's suddenly a fork. Black loses a piece. Nice little sequence. So what is the takeaway? The takeaway is that if you notice a potential tactical theme, you shouldn't discount it just because, the current situation may seem unfavorable, right? So c2 may not work, but that's why type 2 undefended pieces are important, right? If it's a piece that's defended by only one other piece, you should be on high alert. And by the way, knight d4 here doesn't work because white can just drop the queen back. That's why I had to start with knight d4. And only now we play c2, attacking both rooks. Of course, technically, white should have moved the queen away. Or actually, no, white should have probably gone bishop e3. But here we can take and take a2. And we just help ourselves to all of white's queenside pawns. And that's all she wrote. After c2, white drops the rook. We evacuate the queen, and we win the game. Okay. All right, guys, I'm pretty tired. Let's call it a night. This was a shorter episode, but hopefully you enjoyed the encore. And I'll see you guys later. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out. Hope you enjoyed the match with Sevian, and have a good one.